Revelation according to Peter, Barnes that is, Part 8, The Woman. A great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, and the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. And she was pregnant, and she cried out, being in labor and in pain, to give birth. Peter teaches that the woman is actually the nation of Israel, or the rebirth of the nation of Israel, to include all believers, both Jews and Gentiles, including the 144,000. The child is referring to Jesus in the past and in the future, when he will rule the nations with a rod of iron, and the believers will rule with him. He says that many believe the woman is Mary. Even the Catholic Church teaches this. But Peter does not agree.
Some people say, well, it was Mary. It was a symbol of Mary. Mary was the one that gave birth to Jesus, and he did get caught up into heaven over 1900 years ago. The only problem with that is it doesn't fit our context, because verse 6 says that the woman then fled into the wilderness for 3.5 years. See that? Well, we go back and look at the history of Jesus and Mary and Joseph, and there was no fleeing into the wilderness. And apparently this fleeing into the wilderness did not take place until after the child had been caught up to heaven. And so that was after Jesus ascended into heaven in AD 33, Mary had to go and rush off into the wilderness somewhere for 3.5 years, see? And of course there's no evidence of anything of that nature. So I want to get you away from the idea that we're talking about Mary here, we're talking about the nation of Israel, and we're not talking about the nation of Israel in the historic part, we're talking about the nation of Israel in the future, hopefully in the near future, see?
Then another sign appeared in heaven, and behold, a great red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his heads were 7 crowns. And his tail swept away 1/3 of the stars of heaven, and hurled them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth, so that when she gave birth, he might devour her child. Peter teaches that the 7-headed dragon being described here represents Satan. As described in Daniel 2, the 7 heads with the 7 crowns represent 7 nations or kingdoms. The 10 horns represent the 10 nations that will be in power on earth when Jesus returns. In verse 4, it says that the dragon's tail swept away 1/3 of the stars in heaven. This refers to the number of angels that fell with Satan when he was thrown down to the earth following the war in heaven, described in verse 9. And she gave birth to a son, a male, who is going to rule all the nations with a rod of iron. And her child was caught up to God and to his throne. Then the woman fled into the wilderness, where she had a place prepared by God, so that there she would be nourished for 1,260 days. Peter offers that the place of refuge for the true church during the last half of the tribulation period could be Petra, in fulfillment of Revelation 12:6. Petra is an ancient city surrounded by mountains in the desert in southern Jordan, about 90 miles south of Jerusalem. Petra has been inhabited by various civilizations back to 7000 BC. Its main entrance is a narrow 3/4-mile rock gorge called the Sick. The city has long been used as a protective hideaway because there is only one way in and can easily be defended. In fact, this carved rock stronghold of Petra was founded by the descendants of Jacob's brother Esau. As mentioned in Genesis 36:43, many of the Old Testament prophets spoke out against this once mighty city that was the pride of the nation of Edom, which is in the mountainous regions south of the Dead Sea. In verse 5, it says, "And she gave birth to a son, a male, who is going to rule all the nations with an iron scepter, or an iron rod. And her child was snatched up to God and to his throne." Peter teaches that this is the church being snatched away to safety for 3.5 years during the last half of the tribulation. before God's wrath is poured out on the earth, beginning with the opening of the sixth seal. However, among evangelical teachers, this is not a popular view at all, as they teach that the rapture occurs prior to the 7-year tribulation period. They also teach that the man-child in verse 5 represents Jesus' ascension following the resurrection. However, Peter does not agree.
Let me take you back to verse 5 and follow this with me. It says, she gave birth to a son, a male child, who is to rule all the nations with a rod of iron. That's the birth of the kingdom in full power. Her child was called up to God and his throne. That's the rapture of the church, which is an essential element of the kingdom government. The woman fled into the wilderness. Verse 7, and there was war in heaven. Can you see the sequence of events? As soon as the church is raptured, Jesus is now authorized to exercise complete destructive power against all of God's enemies, and he starts where? In heaven. He starts in heaven. According to this statement right here in the book of Revelation, he starts in heaven. He gives orders to the general of his armies. Who's the general of the armies? Michael. And Michael sallies forward with the angelic armies, and the first thing they do is to kick Satan and his demons out of heaven. Psalm 110, sit thou at my right hand until I make thine enemies a stool for your feet. Get it? Now you're seeing the fulfillment of that opening verse of Psalm 110. The enemies are being made the footstool. Are you with me? Yes. You see, when you think of the nation of Israel, what do we know about the nation of Israel? From the nation of Israel comes 144,000, isn't that true? But from the nation of Israel comes all the foundation of the church. Who were all the founder members of the church? The Jews, of course. And so when it says the child was called away to God and to his throne, if that's the rapture, it means all those dead apostles, remember? Their bodies are now being resurrected from the dead and reunited with their spirits, and they're being glorified and being called away to the throne of God. You get it? To begin the rule, to begin the exercise of power. Remember, we looked at Psalm 2, which says that Jesus would rule the nations with a rod of iron. And then we looked at Revelation chapter 2 that said that all the Christians who overcome will rule the nations with a rod of iron. See? So they're beginning to share in this tremendous, dramatic development in the rule of the kingdom of God, which is taking place at this time. Starting with the kicking out of Satan and his demons from heaven, and then proceeding on with the destruction of that entire generation of mankind, with the destruction of all their governments, get the idea? And the ushering in of the peaceful millennial rule of Jesus. That's the way it's put it. So what happens now as a result of the war in heaven? It says that Satan and his demons are cast down. And again, I have to remind you that that hasn't happened yet. And so Satan and his demons are not bottled up down here on the earth at the moment. They have access to heaven. And as verse 10 shows, that they've been using that to accuse God's people, haven't they? You see, before the throne of God.
And there was war in heaven, Michael and his angels waging war with the dragon. The dragon and his angels waged war, and they did not prevail, and there was no longer a place found for them in heaven. And the great dragon was thrown down, the serpent of old, who is called the devil and Satan, who deceives the whole world. He was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. Then I heard a loud voice in heaven saying, now the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Christ have come. For the accuser of our brothers and sisters has been thrown down, the one who accuses them before our God day and night. And they overcame him because of the blood of the Lamb, and because of the word of their testimony. And they did not love their life even when faced with death. For this reason rejoice you in heaven, and you who dwell in them. Woe to the earth and to the sea, because the devil has come down to you with great wrath, knowing that he has only a short time.
But now notice this, look in verse 10. Look at this. I heard a loud voice in heaven saying. Now what was the voice saying? Would that just bring out what the voice was saying?
Now the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Christ have come.
Now notice that. Look, stop right there. What has come? The salvation. And by the way, that's not the salvation of souls. This is talking about physical rescue. This is God rescuing his people, Israel, through the tribulation. The salvation and what?
Power.
The power and the what? Kingdom. You see, very often Christians think that the kingdom came into existence in AD 33, which it did. Jesus went back to heaven in AD 33 to be king of the kingdom. Are you with me? So how can be said in the book of Revelation that now that Satan and his demons are kicked out of heaven, now has come the kingdom and the power and the authority of his Christ? You see the point? Obviously it's a special phase of kingdom rule. The whole scene has changed now. Instead of Jesus having to rule with restrictions, he can rule unrestrictedly now. He has his government there with him in the heavens, and he can bring the full force of his kingly power against all God's enemies, demon and human governments and followers, and to bring about their destruction. Get the picture?
And when the dragon saw that he was thrown down to the earth, he persecuted the woman who gave birth to the male child. But the 2 wings of the great eagle were given to the woman, so that she could fly into the wilderness to her place, where she was nourished for a time, times, and half a time, away from the presence of the serpent. And the serpent hurled water like a river out of his mouth after the woman, so that he might cause her to be swept away with the flood. But the earth helped the woman, and the earth opened its mouth and drank up the river which the dragon had hurled out of his mouth. So the dragon was enraged with the woman, and went off to make war with the rest of her children, who keep the commandments of God and hold to the testimony of Jesus.